Hello, my friends. This is part 3 in a series of videos on what is evidence-based practice, EBP, and what is science. How are they different from each other? And I'm showing you the last slide that we were looking at in part 2 at the end of the previous video. And we were saying that in evidence-based psychology, a statement by the APA, the American Psychological Association, which is the professional organization that oversees the practice of psychology in the United States. The statement is psychological services are most effective when responsive to the patient's specific problems, strengths, personality, socio-cultural context, and preferences. That's just one statement in a large document. But just to emphasize the point that every level of evidence, from analyzing databases to comparing different kinds of qualitative and quantitative research, all kinds of different research models, all the way down to the actual practice of the psychologist with their client, and that the psychologist, the therapist, adapts that knowledge to the context, because no research is going to address the exact context of your practice. But that research should inform and improve your practice. It should inform and improve your practice. If it does not, then EBP is not working, right? Evidence-based psychology is only working if the therapist is given the evidence-based results from the researchers. I quoted before a quote from the information on EBM, evidence-based medicine, how the researchers do the heavy lifting, as it was called, the hard work, the intensive, time-consuming work to filter through all the research and evidence and then present to the health care practitioners what the results are. Same thing in psychology. The therapist gets this information from the researchers, and that information should improve your practice. If it does not, then EBP is not working. And what has happened in almost every profession is that when the clinicians, the practitioners, who generally are not research experts, they just apply the therapy. They like working with clients. They want to use it. They find that their practice is improved by having this better information. They try this new therapy. Ooh, it works better. And they adapt it to the context. So it's working beautifully. Just about every profession is reporting improved results. We also talked about corruption, especially in medicine, that there can be major problems. And I see those major problems as a failure to completely implement the requirements of an evidence-based practice. You cannot have greed or other biases and motivations disturbing the process of the evidence-based practice. Now, in this video, let's talk some more about differences between EBP and science. Now, I mentioned this quote at the end of the previous video. Let's say it again. During the COVID pandemic, we often hear the phrase, follow the science, from people who are encouraging others to get vaccinated. Even scientists may use this phrase. However, the phrase is not quite accurate. A more accurate statement is follow the evidence, because medicine is an EBP. It is not a science. Saying follow the science is an exaggeration. If we want to follow carefully how epistemology works in the 21st century, how do we know if medicine works? How do we know if psychology works? They are not sciences, they're evidence-based practices. So, the distinction may seem subtle or semantic, but it is not. Science gives the feeling of great authority and conviction, and the findings of medicine very rarely rise to the state of science, follow the evidence, acknowledges the complexity of medicine, and the care needed to give the level of confidence that is appropriate for the data that is obtained. Okay. Excuse me. Now this, I've hinted at this before, let's make this very clear. And EBP lowers the bar for areas like psychology as compared to the requirements of the science. Right? If psychology had to be a science, it would have to produce principles that were at the level of confidence that's obtained in a science. Psychology almost never does that. We don't know why people become depressed or anxious. We're not even close to knowing. We know little bits and pieces. So what do? Do we just throw our hands up and say we don't know? Or do we do what was done until the 1970s and let every therapist do what they want? No. EBP says we're going to use the best evidence, even if it's weak. So psychology does not need to show with great conviction that a particular therapy works. That might be surprising. You don't have to show with great conviction that a particular therapy works. You would have to do that if psychology was a science. It only needs to show that the evidence is strongest that a particular therapy is likely to be most effective. So you're going to use the best evidence, even if the evidence is not very good. People have mental and emotional problems, and we do not wait until extremely convincing scientific evidence is obtained. We apply therapies based on the best evidence available and the probabilities that this will help the client. We're dealing with probabilities. To the best of our knowledge, this is what the evidence shows. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the therapy is likely to change at least a little bit, maybe dramatically. It's the best we can do. That's the philosophy of an EBP. We do whatever has the greatest probability of positive outcomes. This is likely to bring benefit to the client and helps the EBP improve over time as more results are reported and more data can be analyzed. This is important. One of the benefits of an EBP is you have strict guidelines. So when a better therapy comes along and there's evidence for it, we must use that better evidence. Right? We have to use it. So many of us in fields like astrology, where you also believe in alternative things, massage, chiropractic, importance of diet, etc. Do these, yoga, does this actually work better? Meditation? If the research shows that it works, by the rules of EBP, they must be utilized. Whatever works the best. We need to do that research, get it published, and make it known that these results are available. If a profession is holding to its own standards, it must embrace whatever works best. This opens the door for astrology and any other field. Much more than was happening before the advancement of EBPs, because then you had to show scientific evidence. So when someone says, do you have scientific evidence for astrology? It's not really the best question. The question is, what does the evidence indicate? It's a level playing field. We just want to know what the highest evidence is. And EBP also lowers the bar for areas like astrology, as I just said. Astrology researchers in the past have often felt challenged to break the barrier in astrology, this barrier that we don't have solid scientific support. It's this feeling like we must puncture a hole through this wall. But there's a different image for an EBP. We don't have to puncture a hole through the wall of lack of scientific support. What we need to do is develop an evidence-based practice, because that's what psychology is, that's what medicine is, and that's what astrology is. What does that mean? It sets up a whole bunch of different criteria, believe it or not. Things like theoretical framework, I'm going to talk about shortly, become much more important in an EBP than they are in science. I'll get to that. My point is this. The requirements of an EBP are different from a science. So the challenge for astrology, if astrology wants to be part of the modern world, is can astrology be an EBP? That's the question. Not does astrology have scientific support. Psychology arguably does or does not have much scientific support. You can debate that, you can argue about it, but it does not affect the position of psychology in our modern world, in our universities. Why? Because psychology is not a science, it's an EBP. And people have psychological problems, and we need to do the best we can for them, so psychology is not going to disappear. It's going to follow the regulations of an EBP, and astrology will do the same. From the viewpoint of astrology as being an EBP, one can view the challenge of astrology as developing the evidence that it is more likely that astrology provides useful information about clients than that astrology provides no useful information. So astrology does not have to have convincing, compelling, overpowering evidence that it works. It just has to have evidence that shows that it's more likely that it works than does not work. That's a huge difference, because the research in evidence-based astrology suggests that astrology works. It's more likely that it works than it doesn't work. That's all you got to do. That's all you have to do. And you're in an evidence-based practice. And as time goes on, the evidence improves, it refines, it gets better, and the evidence-based practice becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. But vibrational astrology is already at the academic level of other evidence-based practices. Okay, to continue with our slides here, instead of the feeling that the astrological research is like a bullet fired to try to penetrate through a wall to break through to a scientific discovery, that's a feeling that a lot of people have about astrology research. That's not the image. It's more of a level playing field, where astrology only needs to show that it is more likely that the information from astrology shows real relationships than it does not. Vibrational astrology does this, and it is an EBP. Okay, it's more likely from the evidence that astrology is providing accurate, useful information than it is not. And the recently published book in early 2022, The Astrology of Bipolar Disorder, A Scientific Breakthrough, presents in great detail a body of knowledge showing that astrology is an evidence-based practice. So in most forms of astrology, requirements and guidelines for evidence do not exist. We don't have strict criteria for what is evidence. Therefore, most forms of astrology are not evidence-based practices. This does not mean that there's no evidence for the rules of astrology. Remember, I read that before. I don't remember if it was in the first or second of this series of videos, that evidence-based medicine does not mean that you have evidence. Just having evidence is not enough. It means, does your medicine follow the best evidence? So when we say that Vedic astrology, Hellenistic astrology, medieval astrology, evolutionary astrology are not evidence-based practices, we're not saying that they don't have evidence. We're not saying that the evidence is weak. We're not saying that those fields are not following the requirements and regulations of an EBP. They haven't prioritized the evidence. They haven't emphasized the research practices and the implementation of research. And we've done dozens and dozens of research studies in vibrational astrology. And we have a solid theoretical framework. We're doing all of the things that are important for an EBP in vibrational astrology. Doesn't mean that vibrational astrology is better or more accurate. It means that it's playing the game, so to speak, of an EBP. Why do we play the game in vibrational astrology? Because it works. Because it works. I mean, if you do research and the research gives you a solid result, we want to know that. I mean, everything about an EBP and its principles is fabulous. The implementation of EBP in medicine, from my personal point of view, is pretty horrible, but that's a problem of implementation. We need to follow the guidelines of EBP, and it's liberating. So it does not mean that there is no evidence for the rules of astrology using other systems of astrology. It just means that the levels of confidence have not been clearly defined. Practitioners are not required to adhere to the standards of evidence. All of that is part of vibrational astrology. Vibrational astrology is an evidence-based practice. There are established standards for what constitutes evidence and what kinds of evidence give us the greatest confidence. And we use those standards in our practice. Other systems of astrology like Hellenistic, medieval, Vedic, evolutionary, modern, psychological, etc. can become EBPs as well if they adopt standards for evidence and require practitioners to utilize the best evidence in consultations. So, Hellenistic astrology or any other kind of astrology could become an EBP if they want to follow the rules for an EBP. So far they have not, but they could. And also keep in mind that according to the regulations for an EBP, the results from consultations are one form of evidence. They are very important and necessary. They're not the only form of evidence. Vibrational astrology is an EBP because it employs the principles of an EBP. Now, what are the principles of an EBP? It's more than just the research. There are several things involved. One interesting part of an EBP is the theoretical framework. The theoretical framework is considered to be very important in an EBP. And what we're going to do next is we're going to define what a theoretical framework is, and we'll define it, and then we'll show what the theoretical framework in astrology is. And I think this is a good place for us to stop. Usually I go for about a half hour. We're only about 16 minutes, but I think we'll start the next video in this series with the discussion of theoretical frameworks. They deserve a video of their own to understand what a theoretical framework is, why it's important, what the implications of a theoretical framework is, and we'll learn about what the theoretical framework for vibrational astrology is. So again, an evidence-based practice means your practice is based on the best possible evidence. What makes evidence good? If the evidence is grounded in a clear, what we call elegant theoretical framework, that gives us more confidence. It's all about confidence. Can we get more confidence about our results? Be more secure, be more certain. And a good theoretical framework makes a big difference. And you may have a good one, you may not. We just do the best we can in whatever field we're in. We are lucky in vibrational astrology that we have an excellent theoretical framework. It strengthens our confidence in the entire system, and it helps guide us to make discoveries. So we will talk about it and describe this in some detail in the next video in this series. Thank you very much for listening, my friends. God bless. Namaste.